Look at Karen's. Karen, you have a lot of sticky notes on there.
Welcome to the Winter Stars book conversation and webinar. We're delighted to have David Iverson, author of Winter Stars, amongst other incredible accomplishments, and David Leventhal, who is one of the founders of Dance for PD, and we'll delve into more of his background in a moment. We're really excited about this conversation, and of course we have our two stars, the Davids, and I'm also joined by Christine Haythorne, our CEO of Parkinson Foundation Western Pennsylvania, and Lauren O'Neill, marketing and design guru. And David, our David and Emily are busy elsewhere. First, I'd like to, and I'm Casey Peluso, Parkinson Foundation Western Pennsylvania. First, I'd just like to go over a few housekeeping items to start. We will have time, about 20 minutes at the end. So the Davids have allowed us to go a little beyond an hour, which is wonderful. So there will be time for questions and answers. And you can either use the chat feature or you can use the raise your hand feature. This is recorded. And lastly, please mute yourselves during the talk. And then when there are questions, you can unmute yourself or type it in the chat feature. So I'm honored to introduce our first presenter, conversationalist, David Leventhal. In addition to being the program director and founding teacher of Dance for Parkinsons, David leads classes for people with Parkinson's around the world. He also trains teachers around the world. David is a very accomplished professional dancer and performed with the Mark Morris Dance Group from 1997 to 2011. And Christine shared with me just a bit ago one of his beautiful dances. So he's very accomplished and he's really done a lot for the Parkinson's population as well. David graduated from Brown University with an honors in English literature. And now Christine will introduce our other presenter and conversationalist today, David Iverson.
Oh my goodness. Dave Iverson had a 30-year career with PBS, during which he wrote and produced more than 25 documentaries. I intended to talk about some of his awards, but he has more than could be stated here, but note that they include several Emmys. Dave was the writer, producer, and director of the Frontline documentary, My Father, My Brother, and Me, which explored his family's personal battle with Parkinson's disease. We all may know Dave from our 2021 virtual conference when we screened his amazing documentary, Capturing Grace. Dave and David Leventhal shared their experience with a group of dancers from Mark Morris Dance Group who had PD. It was really a wonderful program, and if you haven't seen it, please go to our website and watch the recording of that. Dave is a great friend and advocate for the PD community and also for the Parkinson Foundation Western Pennsylvania. But in this book, Dave tackles the challenges of caregiving, both personally and for our aging population with a shortage of caregivers. I want to take a moment to also note that these two gentlemen are extremely generous, not only for the PD community, but for this project in general. The proceeds from Dave Iverson's book are going to 3 charities, a small charity that I didn't write down. I apologize, Dave Iverson, but the other 2 are the Michael J. Fox Foundation and Dance for PD. And for this event, both gentlemen kindly donated their profits to Parkinson Foundation Western Pennsylvania. So with that, I will turn it over to these 2 gents to learn more about this wonderful book.
Thank you so much, Christine and Casey and Lauren, for the welcome and the introduction. We're really delighted to be here with you. And I have to say that anytime I get to spend time with Dave, whether it's on Zoom or in person, as we've done many times over the last 15 years, it's something I look forward to so much. So Uh, glad to be with you, Dave, and glad to be here talking about this incredible book, and more than that, the incredible journey that you've been on, and really coinciding with the production of Capturing Grace. You kept a lot of the details of what was going on in your personal life out of that process. I had no idea when you were making that film just how much you were contending with. I wanted to start by asking you, with the incredible body of work that you've created over 30 plus years as a journalist and a filmmaker. What led you to write this book? Why did you sit down and say, you know what, this would be a good idea for me right now? Why didn't you just say, have this experience, it was exhausting and wonderful, and I'm going to keep it to myself?
Thank you, David. And thank you also, Christine and Casey, and to the Western Pennsylvania Parkinson's community. It's a pleasure to be with all of you today. It's a wonderful question. I think that for me, I've always been drawn to telling stories. And so whether that was in film, like Capturing Grace, or My Father, My Brother, and Me, or through the radio, or through writing in my journal. I think for me, writing has always been a way of kind of figuring things out. You know, it helps me kind of put into place what's going on in my life and give that some perspective. And so as my mom was approaching the end of her life, I started thinking about that a little more. And I realized that it was a good story. And that sounds a little crass in some ways, I suppose. But I think an occupational hazard when you're a journalist is that you think about story and you see the world sort of as in stories. And, you know, when I saw your class dance for the first time, I had that same feeling, like, this is a story worth telling. And I think when you feel that, the best story experiences I've ever had in my life have been when I not only felt that way, but then acted on that. Yeah. And I felt that. So in many ways, David, those experiences are analogous. And when you feel like this is something worth telling, and damn, I'm going to do my best to tell it. And so that's what I set out to do. No idea how difficult the writing would be, let alone the caregiving experience had been, but that's what I wanted to do. And I felt like the time was also right to tell this particular story. And maybe we can talk more about that and what's going on in our country with caregiving, but that was also important to me.
Yeah, I would love to circle back to that a little later, because I think, you know, there's an element of being able to write as a way of working through challenges, working through dilemmas, working through mixed feelings, and this sort of getting it off your chest. But throughout the book, I also feel that there's a really strong message about how we should be doing things differently, and how your experience can inform the experience of other people who are going through the same or similar experiences. So there's really a public service mission that runs alongside the human desire to share something that's going on deeply for us. You know, you say early in the book, I told myself, given my mom's age, it wasn't like this would be a permanent arrangement moving in with her. It all seemed pretty straightforward. And then with that, the age of 59, I moved in with my mom. You say that so matter-of-factly, but I have to ask, and I think this is something that we as readers have to ask, what were you thinking? With everything going on in your life, you know, a kind of a rekindled relationship, film projects, you were still working. At the time, you were doing a lot for the Fox Foundation, reporting and patient advocacy. You had a lot going on. So when this opportunity came up, what were you thinking?
Yeah. Look, not enough, I think, is part of the answer. But I think that, again, it was a feeling of, this is something I want to do. It wasn't a feeling of, I must do this, or I have an obligation to do this, and after all, it's my mom. For whatever reason, I had a feeling like this is something I want to do and kind of need to do. Some of that was because my mom had been my own first lesson in what a caregiver can mean. Although she never would have defined herself as a caregiver for my dad. My dad was diagnosed with Parkinson's a little bit later than my brother and I were. But he was diagnosed at the age of 60 and did well for many years, but his late years were tough. And my mom really showed me something about what it means and how important that is to stand by someone and see that person through. That was part of it. It was also that my mom and I had a special relationship. And of course, she had a special relationship with all of her 3 sons. But my mom and I had a different kind of rapport. And I think that sometimes happens in families. I think if a group of siblings are sitting around and thinking, well, who's going to be the one who takes care of mom? They probably kind of already know that answer, that there's someone there who's likely to kind of play that role. I tell a story that you've heard me tell before about how my mom used to love to tell this story, that when I was a little boy, 2 or 3, I looked up at her once and said, Mom, we sure like each other, don't we? And that was true of us. We liked each other and we understood each other, and that was a part of it. And so it really wasn't with a great deal of thought. You'd think I would have, but I didn't. And in some ways I'm glad, because sometimes there is a value in jumping into something before you've thought your way all the way through it. And I had obviously a great deal to learn. There was so much I did not know, but that's why I did.
Mm-hmm. And how much did your personal journey with Parkinson's play a role in that decision? I'm interested in how it played a role in your approach to giving care and your approach to some of the issues that came up. But in that initial phase, did it come up for you as something that you were that you saw as a potential benefit or perhaps a liability? How did it play a role in your early thinking?
Yeah, it's an important question, because I do think for many people, there's this sense of, you were diagnosed with Parkinson's a couple of years before, and then you did this, kind of what were you thinking? There are a couple of answers to that. One is that I was and continue to be extraordinarily lucky in my version of Parkinson's. As we all know, it's a very idiosyncratic condition. The old saying that if you've met one person with Parkinson's, you've met one person with Parkinson's is true. And I was doing really well. So I think if I had been really challenged, this is not a decision I would have made, but I was doing really well. And then kind of counterintuitively, I think for me also, it was a demonstration to me that I could do this. I think one thing that happens when you're diagnosed with any potentially debilitating condition, you still want to do stuff. You still want to be the person who can make a difference, who can contribute, whether that's at work or at home. And honestly, I think moving in with my mom, I felt pretty good about the fact that I could do that. And I'm someone who likes to feel pretty good about what I'm doing, I guess. And so that mattered to me. But in an odd way also, David, things kind of came together. They were more aligned than you would have thought. I was finishing the filming of My Father, My Brother, and Me. I might have even met you at this point, because we filmed a short scene of a Dance for Parkinson's class as part of My Father, My Brother, and Me. And so Parkinson's was front and center in my life, but living with my mom, we'd sit up at night and talk, and she'd tell stories about my dad, and I'd gain a different perspective on what his life was like. than I would have had otherwise. So in an odd way, and having so admired my mom's own role in caring for my dad, all of that fit together much more than I think would probably have been obvious.
Yeah, I hear you saying that in really being able to get closer to your mom, you learned some things about your dad's journey and perhaps her approach to his journey and his approach that you might not otherwise have gained, and that actually has served you in your own path.
Well, right. And I think that, one of the things about my mom and her own approach to Parkinson's actually was that my mom was quite businesslike in a lot of ways. She was the kind of person who got up every day and thought, okay, what can I do today? What can I get done for the family, for the society, for the Democratic Party, whatever it happened to be. And she was like that. She was kind of all business. It took me actually a while to understand in some ways, growing up and then later on, that she was all business, but her business was us. She was involved in making life better. But that business-like approach was how she served everyone. She did that with my dad. She was very like, well, okay, you got Parkinson's, but we're still gonna go. Bill, we got a Stanford basketball game to go. Let's go. And sometimes people would be a little bit like almost put off by the fact that she wouldn't cut my dad's food necessarily or help him put on his jacket. I think her view was like, you can get your jacket on, Bill. Yes. And so they did. And my cousin, who's a physical therapist, later told me that he used my mom as a model for actually how spouses ought to be with their partners who had Parkinson's, to be loving, but not do everything for them. And now, of course, that changes over time. And of course, my mom did more over time. But she was really the first person who showed me that part of living with Parkinson's, and you've heard me say this before, is continuing. It's about adding things to your life. Parkinson's, I've often said, is a disease of subtraction. It takes things from you kind of one by one. And the way to contend with that, I learned in many ways from my mom and dad, was to keep adding on, to keep going to Stanford games, to keep having people over for dinner, to keep reading the New York Times, whatever it happened to be. And so all of those things fit together, I think.
You talk about, at many points during the book, things that came up for you that you weren't expecting, right? You, by your time in life, you think you know who you are, you know the feelings that tend to come up, you have an expectation of how certain situations are going to evolve and how you're going to feel about them. But in this book, and one of the things I love, many things I love about it, is how vulnerable you are, how much you talk about some of the things that maybe aren't so pleasant for you, or feelings that come up that aren't all, glitter and gold. What are some things that you didn't anticipate in this process? When you said yes, when you moved in, certainly you knew it wasn't going to be, a totally easy road, but were there things that really struck you as unexpected, as surprises? These are either about the process of sharing care or the process that you were going through in your own emotional journey.
Indeed. I mean, it starts with the most basic. I didn't know I'd get so exhausted. I didn't know it would so fundamentally change sleep, that I would need to get up during the night all the time to help my mom in the bathroom. I didn't know I would get so frustrated, because of course, when you're tired, you're not always at your best. I didn't know I would be capable of anger. If you had told me that I would be someone who would yell at my mom, not once, not twice, but many times, I would never have believed it. I didn't know I'd be tested, I guess, in such a way. I also didn't know little things. Like when I first started, I had a caregiver who was in the house 30 hours a week so that I could work. It didn't occur to me that she had a life too, so that if she got sick, she wasn't going to come in, or if her kids got sick, she wasn't going to come in. And then everything was topsy-turvy. I had, it's so basic, but yet I didn't know that. There were so many things like that. I thought if I made a plan for caregiving, and if I had this schedule constructed, and caregiver Tila is here from these hours, and then Mele will come in for these hours, that I'm good. I didn't know that the most carefully crafted plans only work until they don't. And that could be tomorrow. And then you got to redo it. It's a house of cards. It's a fragile enterprise. And if you're someone who likes being in charge, as I do, as you know, Parkinson, caregiving reveals your shortcomings. I've often said, like a heat-seeking missile, it finds your vulnerabilities and exposes them. And so that was a revelation, in not always such a good way, but from which I learned a lot.
Yeah. You say one of caregiving's more difficult, but ultimately more rewarding challenges is to recognize the truth that lies below what is said, right? To try to place yourself inside the other person's reality and then look outward onto what must be an unfamiliar and unsettling new terrain. What a remarkable sense of being able to see the world from a loved one's point of view, truly, and to not always take what is said or unsaid at face value, but to really try to understand, which is a very understandable, but in some ways kind of a self-centered view. Like, what are you telling me? As opposed to, what are you really trying to say that's maybe not being said based on how you're feeling in this moment, in this really unfamiliar terrain? How did you come to that? That, to me, in the book, felt like a resolution, a coming to terms, an awakening, an epiphany. How did you come to that?
Over time, over practice, over many failures. And even when I understood it, I would still fail. That's the thing. Like anything else in life, you don't master caregiving. You just don't. You would never say, I bet, that you mastered things, right? It's you work, you confront challenges, you learn, you adapt, you get better, and then you fall. You fall on your face. Probably you fall on your face sometimes as a dancer too. And so I learned, but I want to say that doesn't mean I nailed it, or that I got it exactly right. But yes, I think when someone has dementia and begins to be confused or very forgetful, you're tempted to say, well, no, that's not exactly right. This is what's right. Or to say what I learned to be the least useful phrase of all. Don't you remember, Mom? Don't you remember? We just did X or Y. That's so unhelpful and so unuseful. And what I learned over time with my mom is that she could say something that wasn't true factually, but was true for her. It was her reality. So that if she said she'd been left in the bathroom for hours and hours by one of our caregivers, I knew that was not true factually. But it took me, in that instance, talking to the caregiver and learning that the caregiver had helped my mom into the bathroom, come back 2 minutes later, and my mom had fallen asleep. And she was just sitting there dozing. And so Mele let her doze for a while, then woke her up, and my mom was sort of startled. Think about it from our point of view. She didn't sleep for hours. She wasn't left alone for hours. But from my mom's point of view, it must have felt something like, I know I came into the bathroom, and then all of a sudden, I'm like, what's happening? It must have felt to her. It wasn't hours and hours, but she wasn't wrong. It felt like hours and hours. And so, the old saying that you're entitled to your own opinions, but not your own set of facts, I don't think is true for someone with dementia. I think someone with dementia is entitled to their own set of facts. They're just not our facts. And I think realizing that helped me even though I would continue to, I remember correcting her when she would say she went to law school. Well, rather than, which she didn't, but the better response would have been, well, tell me what was interesting about that. Or why were you interested in the law? Is it because you thought about politics and maybe running for office someday, which you should have done? But that's what I mean about the truth behind the words.
Yeah. I'm reminded here of some of the thought and attention that goes into being an actor, right? Understanding what is going on internally for that character. How can you as an actor make that scene compelling based on your point of view, even if from an audience perspective, it may seem completely ridiculous or not based in reality. And it got me thinking about that wonderful description of guidance that you tie back to Michael J. Fox. And I was wondering if you might read that passage about going to the beach and that trip that brought up this idea of just being present, whatever's happening in that moment, and what that does, how that changes your relationship to caregiving.
Yes, and no, I'd love to, David. Thank you. This is something probably many of you may have heard Michael J. Fox say, but it applies to a rule he says he learned as an actor, which is that you always have to just play the scene you're in. That even though you have the script and you know how the story ends, you can't act with that knowledge in mind. You have to just play the scene you're in. And he says that not only applies to acting, but it applies to living with Parkinson's. That when you have Parkinson's, you may think you know how the story is going to end, but you can't act that way. You've got to play the scene you're in. I believe that is so profound, and that it applies much more broadly to living with not only any debilitating condition, whether that's dementia or Parkinson's, but for all of us, really, to be just like you and I are right now, David, to be present to that, to pay attention to that, not drifting off somewhere else. So this is about a trip to the beach I took with my mom when she was 102 and a half or so. Dementia was pretty advanced, her vision was failing, but she loved the beach. And so we went. As we drew closer to the ocean that fine spring day, I turned to my mom and said, "Mom, I have to keep my eyes on the road, so you let me know when you see the ocean." Her vision was fading, but when we got about 100 feet from the water, she exclaimed, "I see it," and a wide smile creased her face. We were at the point when I wanted us both to savor those moments, precisely because I knew they would not last. The moments can't be banked or reclaimed later when you need a good moment credit. And as we drove along the water on this beautiful spring day, I tried to remember to do better, to just play the scene I was in, to take in the joy I saw on her face precisely because it would only be experienced. Then I tried to remember that moments are to be treasured because they do not last. Like a cloud pushed by the wind, moments part as they become. As always, we pulled to a stop at Pescadero State Beach, our ocean destination for the past 60 years. No one in my family knows why this is true. There are prettier beaches nearby, but Pescadero is home. We sat, watched, and were quiet. And as we sat there, I happened to notice that the children's book, The Little Engine That Could, was on the back seat. I'd recently purchased a copy to take back east to read to my then 3-year-old granddaughter. And I don't know why, but I asked my mom if she wanted me to read it to her. And she said yes. Maybe she just liked the title, since Like the little engine, she always thought she could too, and was deeply annoyed when she could not. For my mom, getting old didn't include giving herself a pass. Accepting limitations was not within her DNA. It was her greatest strength, and now sometimes the source of her greatest sorrow. But in that moment, I read her a story, and together we took in the sound of the words, the wind, and the waves. Me, it's pretty out here today, isn't it? Adelaide, I like what's covering me. Me, do you mean your blanket? Adelaide, I mean the sky.
Hmm.
If I could just add, David,
Yeah.
one thing that's evident in that last quote of my mom's that I also learned about dementia. I'd love to know if others here today have experienced this, if they're living with someone with dementia, is that you can be poetic and forgetful, wonderfully articulate and not know have a clue about what's going on. You can be both. My mom would sometimes say these extraordinary things. Once I was wanted to show her some pictures of her grandchildren on my laptop, and the laptop screen was dark and it just stayed dark. And my mom kept staring at it. And then she said, it's like looking into a dark river and not being able to see the fish. Like, where did that come from? I mean, I would actually love to know more about what's going on sort of synaptically, if that's the right word, within the brain. But there's a lot there sometimes that I don't think we fully accept, or not accept, but are tuned into. I think that's why my mom was always such a fierce defender of my dad in the last 15 months of his life when he lived in an assisted living facility. She said, do not call him, to whoever was caring for him, you do not call him Sweetie. He is not Sweetie. He is Professor Iverson. It was her stern business-like self, but maybe it was for a reason, because she knew that deep inside my dad, there was still wisdom, even if he couldn't talk much, even if he couldn't move.
I'm struck not just by the beauty and poetry of your writing in that section and throughout the book, but the artistic sensibility that seems to wash over this awareness or interpretation of what people living with dementia might be saying, that we've exited the world, the scientific, factual world of black and white and of facts as evidence-based, and we have entered the world of art. We've entered the world of different interpretations. We've entered the world of gray areas. We've entered the world of looking at a painting and not knowing right away what it means and being okay with that. Of the poetic power of language that isn't always a linear path, but has multiple meanings and surprises. And it seems to me that that element, that appreciation, whether it's intentionally artful or not, it provides a lens to view situations that might otherwise be incredibly stressful and depressing, and reframes them into beauty, possibility, capacity that's still there, capacity to make meaning that might be different from the meaning that was created 10 years ago, but is still valuable and still is a grounds for having a relationship with somebody.
I think that's a wonderful insight, and not one I'd fully really thought about before, in that sense of that in art there is often ambiguity and uncertainty, and it's also participatory. It's not only what you as the artist put forward, but what the audience brings to it as well. And I think in that sense, as an audience, if you will, if you're to someone who has dementia, I think it taught me something that I needed. I mean, part of what I write about late in the book is it wasn't just my mom who needed help. I did too. I needed to become a little less sure of myself and a little less certain and a little less, I know what's right. To bring less certainty and more sympathy is really so much at the heart of caregiving. I learned that in many ways from Eileen and Sanai, the two principal caregivers who were with me for so much of that decade, because they had this ability that even if Adelaide was cranky, and she could be cranky, to just take it, not carry it with them, not hold a grudge about it, and walk back into that room 5 minutes later and be as sunny and warm as ever. So I think for me, it provided so many life lessons in precisely, it was annoyingly aligned with all of my shortcomings. You know? So it was like the antidote, you know, to the not so great side of Dave. So yeah.
But towards the end of the book and the journey, you have a pretty dramatic shift in what you're willing to do. And I think some of that comes with trusting the professional, if I use that word, caregivers who are there, and just understanding the deep relationship that they've formed with Adelaide, but also a sense that you needed to reclaim some time and space for you in order to live your life. But I think it becomes clear in the book, in order to be able to really value and treasure the remaining time with your mom, that if you'd stayed in the situation that you were in before you made this shift, that it was getting to a point of overwhelming negativity. And so you made that, it seems like you made that change really to be able to return to a place where you could just appreciate the remaining time. And I'd love you to talk about, we didn't talk about that in our last conversation. I'd love to hear about that a little bit.
No, it's true. I started out having nights and weekends with my mom. So I would be kind of on duty, you know, from sort of 5:36 in the evening until the next morning when I'd go to work, come back at night, do the same thing. And then all weekend. So it was a lot of hours, you know, whatever that adds up to be, well over 100 hours a week. Over time, I got a little more help so that I could take a weekend off sometimes, or even go away for longer. But what I often would feel, David, was that I would have this time away, but I wouldn't be recharged by it. I'd walk back in and feel like, here I am again. I felt like I would always be tethered to this role.
Yeah.
And even though I gained insight and wisdom and got better and better at what I was doing, there came a point about 8.5 years in where I felt like I just can't. And it actually happened, it came about in part because once again, I kind of lost it. My mom had said she hadn't been to church, and I told her that she had, but I haven't been to church. Yes, you have. Back and forth until I finally said, yeah, you did. You just don't remember. And I knew when I said that, like, you know, that's about as useful as telling someone with Parkinson's that their hand shouldn't shake, you know. And yet I still did it. And I felt like I need to do something different. And I And you're right. I felt I could do that because I felt like it wasn't all on me, that I had these two wonderful people, Eileen and Sinai, that she would have the best care possible. And so I shifted. The first shift was I just wasn't sleeping 10 feet away down the hall anymore. I was sleeping back in my dad's study at night. I could close the door. I still remember the first night I could close the door in 8 years. That was extraordinary. And then from that, I was fortunate enough, and perhaps we'll be able to talk about this too, to have the resources for a very specific reason, that I could add more care. And so then I just started spending 2 nights a week at my mom's. And I now lived with my partner, now wife, Lynn, and I visited my mom. And that word, that verb, to visit, makes all the difference. And it allowed me to feel like I was a son once again. And I didn't feel like I was stepping away. I was just stepping to the side a little bit. I could be more like a son in the way that you're loving, but there's also a little bit of distance, you know. I could give her a kiss and say goodnight and leave, you know, as a son does. And I have Eileen and Sinai, and really my parents to thank for that, because my parents bought a home in Menlo Park, California in 1950 for $15,000. Menlo Park is in the heart of Silicon Valley. So by the time I moved in, it was worth just a little bit more. And that allowed me to borrow again and again and again against the house to get those resources. Most people do not have that advantage. But that's part of the story too.
And as we think about the role that Eileen and Sinai played in your mom's life and your life, what are some lessons that we can use from that experience to extrapolate on our current circumstances, social, political, budgetary? You've written about this a little bit in some op-ed pieces that you've written about caregiving policy. What model did they show that really moved you forward in thinking about the incredible deficits that we have societally in this area and how we need to think differently about it?
Well, first, they were women not only of great compassion and great care and great love, which is enormous. They were also women of great skill. The example I often use is that my mom had beautiful skin right up until the day she died. And she spent the last 2 years of her life in bed. And yet her skin was perfect. Well, talk to anyone who has been in nursing homes or assisted care facilities or who works in the field of aging. That just doesn't happen. It doesn't happen unless you have someone who's extraordinarily skilled, in this case, Eileen, who knew just how to support my mom, to rotate her ever so gently, to pad one side of the bed with a pillow this way and then change it to this way, to know the signs of darkening skin, to apply what would work and what wouldn't, and to watch it like a hawk. You know, there's enormous skill. We don't value that enough in this country. Those 4 caregivers who are with me principally, Mele Toffa, Ronette Morales, Sinai Latu, and Eileen Khan, were all immigrant Americans, all women of color, all women for whom English was a second or sometimes third language. And they were extraordinary. And we do not value that care enough in this country. The average wage for people doing this work, according to the Brookings Institution, as of 2019, is $12 an hour in this country. Now, it's more than that in the Bay Area. It's probably more than that in Pittsburgh. And I was able to do much more than that because of the resources that I had. But we need to do a lot better than that. So I actually have a request for everyone watching right now. And that is, the next time you hear someone say, well, sure, we need immigrants in this country, but they have to be skilled. They have to have the kind of skills we need in our society. Well, ask them what those skills are and why we need them. Because it's not just technology skills we need in this country. We need the skills of tender and loving care. We need the skills of someone who can keep you from getting a bed sore. Because guess what? Everyone is going to need care. And most of us are going to wind up providing it too. We need that. And we have such a long ways to go in this country to achieve that. And we need to advocate for not only professional caregivers like the women I just mentioned, but for family caregivers as well, who often feel so alone. I often felt alone, and I held it as good as anyone can have it as a caregiver.
Yeah.
We need to do all of that. And I hope that these conversations will spur us in that direction.
Towards the end of the book, you recount several Christmases, one that you thought would be perhaps the last one together. And then there was another one that came up the next year, although it wasn't, it was maybe a little bit earlier, right? The wonderful description of, I would say, a deepening understanding and just a depth of relationship that where a lot of the anger and challenges have perhaps evaporated, and you're left with just simple truths and simpler communications, and just knowing by looking into each other's eyes that there's great love. And I wanted to invite you to share that passage with us as a transition into some questions and conversation with the group. Would that be comfortable?
Yeah, no, I'd like to do that. And two quick setup bits of information. One is that this happened, David, after I'd made that transition. So I'm now coming down to my mom's, several days a week and spending 2 nights a week. But I'm the son now, much more than the everyday care provider. The other note I want to say is that my mom was terribly restless the last year, particularly of her life, last year and a half or two. I mean, she was always in some ways a person on the move. So she always had a certain restlessness.
What are we going to do today?
Right,
Yeah.
right. Her favorite question. What are we going to do today? But now she was confined to a bed. And I think that frustrated her, even though she couldn't really communicate that. But she was restless. She would kick at the guardrails in the hospital bed as if to say, let me out of here. I want to do stuff. But this night was different. When I walked into my mom's bedroom, I knew right away that on this December night, she was in a different place. There wasn't any restlessness. She just seemed quiet and calm. She looked to be quite remarkably at peace. We just sat there for a long time, holding hands, and I felt a wave of tenderness come over me. After a while, my mom looked at me and said in a voice that was soft and only slightly slurred, "You look wonderful." And I told her she did too. And then I said, "We make a good pair." And she smiled and said, "What a pair." And then just sat for a while, my hand on top of hers, just sitting together, nothing more. And then she turned her head to me and said, "I feel lucky. Feel lucky." And she said it with more clarity than anything I'd heard her say in recent months. And I told her that I felt lucky too, lucky for all that she had added to my life and to the lives of those around her, and that I would always remember what she had taught me. And then she said it again. "I feel lucky." And so I asked her if she could tell me why. And there was a long pause. And then she looked at me with eyes as bright as winter stars, and said, "Because there's love all around." On that Christmas night, I felt something I had not experienced before, that while my time with my mom was still unfinished, our journey was now complete. We had endured our bursts of anger and frustration, and over time, our deep and abiding connection had held. And while the currents of time and age had taken us into territory we'd never imagined, we'd kept traveling. And that journey had carried us to our truest destination as mother and son. It had brought me to the bedside of someone I loved so that I could hear the deepest of all truths, that there is love all around.
Yeah, it is. It is such a beautiful passage. And I've read the book a few times, and it's still, as you can see, deeply moving and so beautiful.
Thank you,
Thank you,
Dave.
Dave. Thank you. This would be a good time to invite your comments, your questions, your observations. And since we're an intimate group, you're welcome to post those into chat and I will share them with Dave for feedback. Or if you'd like to vocalize your question or comment, I just invite you to raise your hand through the raise hand feature, which you can find in the reactions button below. Donna has demonstrated perfectly. So I'm gonna ask Donna to unmute yourself and ask your question.
Oh, Dave, David, I have so many questions, but one I wanted to bring up to you is ask you about your impression of hospice and the way it's run. And it seemed like in the end of the book, your caregivers knew more about how to handle this than any hospice worker. And they kind of guided you, and the hospice kind of let you down in that last moment. And I just wonder what you would think of your own caregiving needs in the future. And if you're as thinking that you'll find them like you did with Sinead and Eileen. I mean, are they still going to be around, or how would you handle your own caregiving needs? Or, you know, because then with Parkinson's, but I just wonder your impressions of hospice and how you think it's run.
Happy to talk about both those. The one thing I would say about hospice is it's important not to generalize. Hospice is not a single entity. Every community has many hospices, and there are thousands of hospices across the United States, probably tens of thousands. And so my own experience with hospice was actually, until the final day that you mentioned, really wonderful. We had a wonderful hospice nurse, Chris Brady. Helped that he was a guy, because my mom always preferred men. And he had a wonderful way with Adelaide. And among the things that he was great at was he was very respectful of what Eileen and Sinai knew, and that they knew her in many ways best. So we would often defer to her, not because he wasn't an extremely knowledgeable, experienced hospice nurse, but because he knew they had insights that he might not have. So hospice actually, in my experience, until that final day of my mom's passing, was great. But it's something to be prepared for, in a sense, because your hospice nurse can't always be there. He works a regular day. So if you need hospice in the middle of the night, it's more the luck of the draw in terms of who you get. And the person who came was not only took 5 hours to get there when she said she'd be there very shortly, but was spectacularly unhelpful when she came, at least to me, and probably because I was in this intense time, and saying something like, "This is a time for you to be with your mom," like I didn't know that, you know, or we want you to do what you think is best. Morphine can be your friend. That I needed more specific help than that, like how many milliliters, you know. But that just happens. And so I wouldn't ever want to generalize about hospice based on that experience. As for what I will want and need, that's a wonderful question. I've thought about it a lot. I haven't done enough in that regard, because I think it's incumbent on all of us to kind of write out what we would like to have happen. It's not enough to just have an advance directive and check off a box that says, no, I don't want to be intubated. I don't want to be resuscitated, whatever. Because in fact, you might well. If I had a heart attack today, you bet I'd want to be resuscitated, because I have a lot to live for still. So you have to write down what matters to you, I think, and what kind of quality of life you want and how you define quality of life, because otherwise, what does that mean? You know, does that mean you still want to be able to do a hike in the woods? That's quality. So we all need to figure those things out. I've thought about it, haven't done enough. And as for care, I'd like to think this is not the reason why I stay in touch with Eileen and Sinai, but I do. My wife and I had them over for lunch, actually, Eileen, Sinai, and Ronette, couple of weeks ago. I don't think I will be that spectacularly lucky to have people like that. But I think thinking about that, who you'd like, having a network of friends who know other caregivers that you can call upon, all of that stuff is things worth preparing for that had never occurred to me when I walked into this situation. But thank you for raising those questions. They're really important ones.
Thanks, Dave. Lynn weaves in and out of this book in wonderful ways, often reflecting back to you her own impressions of sort of how you are in the situation. You are in a situation that maybe you don't have control over. That can be frustrating. Christine had a question about how this journey and what you learned about each other during this journey impact or change your relationship with Lynn over time. And I'd love to hear about that.
It did. I mean, Lynn and I had been together a long time. When I moved in with my mom, Lynn and I had been together for, I guess, 8 years. And that marched on for the next decade. She was incredibly patient and supportive. She knew why I wanted to do this and supported that. But that didn't mean it was easy, you know. Mm-hmm. She'd come down and spend the weekend or part of the weekend one night with me, and then in time I would go up to her place. But it was challenging, and it also I think part of what was challenging is that she would say to me, you know, I feel like your mom's your first priority, and I would say all kinds of reasons why. No, you know, but she was actually right, you know. Mm-hmm. And it became clear once when we were both big Stanford fans. We'd both gone to Stanford, and Stanford was going back to the Rose Bowl for the first time in many years. And she and I had made plans to go, and I was going to have someone cover while I was gone. And then I started thinking that my mom had gone to the Rose Bowl in 1951. And wouldn't this be fantastic, like 60 years later, to take her again? Because at that point, she still could have. And so I said to Lynn, wouldn't that be a fun idea? And she looked at me in a steely-eyed way she rarely does and said, "You two have a nice time." So yeah, I had to reprioritize. And that was, of course, part of why in the end, I could not only become a son again, but I could become a true loving partner to Lynn again. And it's not coincidental that shortly after that, we got married. Yeah, so it definitely affected. And in the end, I think it's strengthened and deepened our relationship, but not without its challenges, for sure.
Yeah. Lauren has a question about what your family thinks of the book, and you have an extended family. They're mentioned many times in the book, and I'd love to hear if you're willing to share some of the reactions and feedback that your loved ones have shared with you.
Yeah. It's funny, I kept the writing, they all knew I was writing the book, but I didn't share it with them intentionally. Some of that's the journalist in me. You don't want to get prior approval from the people you're writing about. That's just not a great road to go down. But when it was getting closer to publication, I did ask my daughter and my niece, one of my nieces and my nephew, to read, not all of it, but large chunks, because I wanted to be really sure I was telling the family part of the story right. And I wanted to be particularly sensitive to my two brothers who were not able to play a large role, although they did play a large role in the sense that they were both hugely supportive. They both had health challenges of their own. My older brother, Parkinson's, my younger brother for other reasons. They weren't able to do that, but they really made sure I knew. And they did help in ways that they could. But I really wanted to make sure I was telling that part of the story in particular, right? And the stuff about Parkinson's, because my older brother and my older brother was much more private than I was about Parkinson's. So, I know more about what some of my, once removed relatives think than the most immediate, I suppose. And my older brother, unfortunately, didn't live to see the book's publication. He passed away of late stage Parkinson's almost a year and a half ago. I hope he would have liked it. He was a fine writer and a distinguished scholar who went through a really, really hard time. And my sister-in-law is someone who I have great love and admiration for, and was so key to keeping my brother in the best place he could be. So that's a kind of in and around answer to that question. I'll see my daughter shortly. I'm sure we'll talk more about it, and I'm sure she'll have some interesting observations to make.
Thank you. Donna, another question. Yes.
Yeah, David, I just had a question about your own Parkinson's journey, and if you had any doubts enter your mind while you're doing caregiving, because you can't do the exercise you want to do, you can't sleep the way you want to sleep, you can't eat the diet you want, it's all time consuming. So how did you take on this challenge? You know you were facing Parkinson's, but I know you ran marathons and stuff, and I'm just amazed how you found the time. But
Yeah.
I mean, did that ever enter your mind? Like, I'm giving up my while I have good quality, and maybe not maintaining it enough while I'm taking care of my mother. How did that affect you? And maybe it was your mission in life. You're giving so much. So what's your new mission in life? Because you're doing really well and you're keeping Parkinson's at bay. So you must have a destiny. And I want to know how you do that.
Well, a couple things. One is, again, I was doing really, really well at the time I moved in with my mom, just 2 years into diagnosis. And while I knew what might lie ahead, I felt confident, and increasingly confident, that I might have a slower progression. And that was based actually on the film I was making at the time and learning about the value of research, and that there are so-called outliers, people who continue to do quite well. So I had hopes for that. I also had support. I had Eileen and Sinai and Mele and Ronette and others sometimes. So I did have some time. I could train for a marathon, which takes a lot of time, which actually was extraordinarily helpful, I believe, to how I was doing with Parkinson's. But again, not every caregiver has that advantage. But that was really important to me. I loved running. I loved the discipline of it. I loved keeping track of my runs, which you do when you're in training. And I loved the solitary nature of it. I loved being all by myself and not thinking about anything other than it's mile 7, 1 foot after the other, mile 7.5, 1 foot after the other. I loved that. I think that for me, physically, mentally, emotionally, was extraordinarily helpful and really useful in terms of Parkinson's. So useful for both my caregiving role and my life with Parkinson's. But there's no underestimating the fact that I had advantages. There's no underestimating the great good fortune I have to have a version of the condition that seems to respond well to medication, to just be where I am. I know that, and I try to remember to be really grateful for that.
Thank you. We have just a few more moments here. Time for one or two more questions. Anyone would like to ask? I see one from Christine. Who says, am I the only one on this call who had moments of surprise when reading this book? Dave admitted to feelings that I have had, but was afraid to admit and would never have voiced. And she found it freeing. And to voice it, not just in conversation, but on paper, permanently, in ink.
Yeah. Well, I really wanted to tell this story in an unvarnished way, because I thought that would resonate with people, and perhaps the way it just did for Christine. And honestly, Christine, that response that you just gave is probably the most common response that I've received from other caregivers. I think that a good story has to be honest, has to be candid and truthful. Otherwise, it's not doing what a good story can, which is to give you an opportunity to say, yes, that I know that feeling. And you know, there's a chapter in the book called The Two Adelaides, in which I describe the Adelaide that was, on her game and the Adelaide that wasn't, but also those were my mom's words. She once said, there are two Adelaides. There's a good Adelaide and a bad Adelaide. And there's a good Adelaide who can do lots of things, and there's a bad Adelaide that can't. And I think the bad Adelaide is here right now. It's the most startling, candid, perceptive description, I think, of dementia as you could ever hear. But as my wonderful friend David Leventhal once observed, there wasn't just two Adelaides, there were two Daves. There was the good Dave and the not so good Dave. And the good Dave makes plenty of appearances in the book because he made plenty of appearances, during caregiving. And that's part of the story too.
Dave, I noticed that at the end of April, you spoke at the Avenidas Caregiving Conference, and Avenidas is the third organization to which proceeds from this book will go. I'd love to hear, just as we wrap up, the different communities that you've shared this work with and hope to continue to reach out to. Obviously, the caregiving community is a big one that goes beyond the Parkinson's world. And I'd love to hear some of your hopes and dreams around sharing this message.
Sure. Thank you, David. I've been really fortunate, and I've realized that if I keep at it and keep knocking on doors, and people like Christine and Casey and Lauren answer and say, sure, you can talk to our group, that there's a lot of places and spaces to talk about this topic, from Parkinson's organizations to caregiving support groups, to caregiving conferences, to the Rotary Club. I've spoken to the Rotary Club once and speaking to another one next week. And I think there's a reason for that. And the reason is our demographics. You've probably heard me say this before, but someone turns 65 every 8 seconds in this country. So that means that by the time we end our conversation today, there will be 1,000 more 65-year-olds in this country than there were when we started. There will be 16,000 more 65-year-olds in this country by this time tomorrow. So caregiving and elder care will affect all of us. And so that's what I want to try to do, is talk about this issue, advocate for this issue, and also be a voice that honors tries to honor the people who do this work, the Sinais and Eileens of this world. And so I will just say that the best part of speaking at the Avenidas conference in particular was that at the end of the talk, my wife Lynn had thought of, well, let's get a Sinai there. So we called Sinai, and she was able to get away from her current caregiving job and be in the audience, which was just so great to talk about her and have, a couple hundred people there. And at the end of my talk, a couple of people came up with books. And I, of course, assumed that they wanted me to sign the book. Well, they didn't want me to sign it. They wanted Sinai to sign it. And one wanted Sinai and Lynn to sign it. Well, that was pretty fantastic. That's like the best response ever. And so I think if that can happen more, if this book can resonate with others and we can sense the truth of this need and this story and move forward in this country so that kind and loving care is the expectation, not unusual. And I will feel really, really good about whatever small part my story, my mom's story in this book has played in that process.
Dave, thank you so much. You have deeply touched everybody here today. And I know that people who are watching the recording will be as touched as well by your writing, your words, your sharing today, and for the candor with which you describe this incredible journey, and also the love that emanates really from the very first page to the very last page. The love, the kindness, the deep commitment to care and to ensuring that each of our journeys has a sense of dignity and respect and a sense that we are not alone. You've captured that here today, and I know that you will continue to share the importance of that message with communities near and far. So on behalf of everybody on the team, thank you so much for the book and for sharing your time with us today.
Well, thank you, David, for as always, we've had the opportunity to do these conversations together a number of times now, and you do it so beautifully and with such love and tenderness and insight. You are an artist in so many ways, including being able to lead an artful conversation. So thank you from the bottom of my heart. And thank you to Casey and Christine and Lauren and the others at Western PA for doing this. I don't know if Casey or Christine, are you coming back on the line? If not, I will just encourage people to buy this book, because the proceeds do in fact go to the Michael J. Fox Foundation, Dance for Parkinsons, Avenidas, and also today to the Western Pennsylvania Parkinsons Foundation. So, and you can get it anywhere from Amazon to your local bookstore. So thank you, and forgive that shameless self-promotion.
Dave, I am gonna pop the link to your website in chat here for people to find it, because one of the great things that Dave has on his site is all of the various channels for purchasing the book. And I love that you put, I think it's called, is it Goodreads?
It used to be called IndieBound, and now I'm forgetting what it's called. But that
bookshop.org, I think.
Yeah, your local local bookstore. Yeah.
So it allows you to order it online as you would at some of the larger conglomerates, but the proceeds will go to your local bookstore. And I think as we talk about the value of supporting local communities and ensuring strong local communities that can provide the kind of care and support to those of us who need it, I think that's a good way to go. But there are several channels on there through which to purchase the book. So Thanks again.
Thank you.
Thank you so much to Dave Iverson and David Leventhal for scheduling this not once, but twice. We are going to share it with our broader population, and I know it will be one of our favorite videos on our YouTube channel. So thank you both for your insights and care. We're all leaving this better than we started.
Thank you, Chris.
Absolutely. Thank you so much
you.
to you both.
All right. Thank you all. Bye-bye.
Everyone be well.
Bye, everyone.
I'm spreading the word.
Thank you, Donna.